the website, for example, where you'll find plenty of examples of people speaking the language, reading poems, talking conversationally, doing all sorts of things in spoken Scots. So it's to kind of find a space, it's to kind of safe space where everything really is in the language.
Since devolution, has the picture begun to change? Because as I said at the start, I don't know if it happened to you, but you were punished for speaking Scots or it's actively discouraged. But have things begun to change in recent years, what with an SNP government and so on?
Well,
And the devolution picture, sorry.
Yeah, well, in 1999, obviously, the Parliament was reconvened and things have changed since then. I think I've been very lucky because most of my time where I've been active in the Scots language world has been since the Parliament came back. And we've had ready access to folk at Holyrood and we've been able to speak to them about our concerns, about our issues, and we've been able to promote those. And sometimes we've had responses, sometimes people have been responsive and sometimes they haven't. It certainly was the case in the first few years of devolution that it was quite difficult sometimes to get the message over because people didn't always understand what you were speaking about. Some people hadn't come from a background where this was an issue. So they weren't aware of what the issues actually were. So I think a lot of that was about framing those issues in terms that made sense to people. And what we used, and certainly what I used when I've been lobbying for Scots, is to frame them in terms of community rights, of communal rights, so talking to people in ways that make sense to them. So if people have come from a background where they've maybe been involved in working class politics or women's issues or lesbian and gay rights or this kind of stuff, it's to try to frame language issues in terms that make sense to people who've come from that background. So we talk to people about, well, what is it? Why is this wrong? What makes this a bad thing to do to speak this language? What exactly is it that's wrong with saying hoose rather than house? Let's put it in very straightforward terms. What is it about those words coming out of people's mouths that make folk feel so upset? And so we're trying to say to folk, this is just another way of speaking. Don't panic about it. Respect it. And respect the people who speak like that. And respect their communities. And start to support people who speak in this unique and special way and start to see it as something valuable. But the key people that you've really got to talk to are the people who speak Scots in the first place, because they're the ones who've had these horrible messages delivered to them about their language and about the way they speak. And our job is to say to them, this is something fantastic, amazing, wonderful. You own it. Keep using it, feel proud of it, pass it on to your kids, and don't be ashamed of this thing.
Yeah, it's amazing the double standards. Like, there was two things. One, you said earlier, I'd just like to go back to, like, a kind of double standard. If someone used an old English word that had kind of fallen out of use, if a writer used it, they would talk about how kind of clever and wonderful that was to bring up a special effect by evoking this old word. But then you said this ill cane, which is even more recently in use, but someone brings that up and it's, why are you doing that? That's a kind of strange. And then this kind of double standard here again, where if you look at other smaller countries next to a bigger country, if people speaking Estonian instead of Russian, or people speaking Catalan, I suppose, instead of Spanish, people are applauded for it. They're encouraged. Oh, what a beautiful language. That's wonderful. But, for speaking in Scots, you're given a very, very hard time usually.
Something, Michael, if somehow or other, there was a kind of English version of Brigadoon and it appeared, somebody found in deepest Dorsetshire or something, a community of folk who had been left undisturbed for hundreds of years and they spoke in some kind of archaic form of English. This would be a community that would be lauded, celebrated, everybody would be hugely excited about it. But here in Scotland, we actually do have communities of people who are speaking in using speech forms which are hundreds of years old. Centuries and centuries and centuries people have spoken like this, and these people are treated with contempt much of the time. Now, that's absolutely outrageous situation, but it isn't unique. There's always prejudice against language. There's always prejudice against people who speak differently from you, and I know this from having lived in Finland, which is a multilingual country, and there's a certain element in Finnish society, Finnish-speaking people, for example, who would be quite happy if all the Swedish speakers jumped in the Baltic Sea and disappeared. But that's just a fact of life. But we've got something else here, which is to do with the fact that this country and the things that make it special and make it stand out are seen as threatening to some folk. So it's not just linguistic prejudice, it's also about the constitutional situation. It's about where we've come from politically and constitutionally, and that has an impact on it as well. Now, we're not unique. Estonia, of course, went through some very difficult times, and there was a huge influx of Russian speakers, and Estonian and Russian speakers live together in that space now. There are problems, but our situation is in many ways unusual. The main other language here is the global language, and it has enormous prestige, it has enormous value, and our speech form, the one that has survived in all different parts of the country and is spoken in various forms, diluted or not, hasn't got any of that status.
You mentioned the constitutional situation. If the constitutional situation is to change, obviously in the big direction of independence, what would you like to see happening? How do you think that would help the language?
Well, I think what we can see is that since 1999, things have changed enormously. Now, some of that has happened externally and some of it's happened internally. And people aren't so frightened about Scottishness any longer. It isn't such a big deal as it once was. I grew up in a time when Scottish things, I remember Joyce Macmillan writing about this, Scottishness was seen as vulgar and unpleasant and something that had to be excised. And I don't think that's so prevalent, that attitude. I think Joyce spoke about a kind of bulls in the mouth kind of aunties who were horrified and appalled if a Scots word was uttered. And I think Janice Galloway's spoken about that recently too. Now, since 1999, what's happened is there have been policies developed, there has been support given to Scots, there has been the signing of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, which commits the Scottish Government to certain responsibilities, to taking certain actions to support Scots. The Parliament's accessibility, of course, has helped, and the fact that many people in the Parliament are from Scots-speaking backgrounds themselves certainly hasn't been an impediment either. So what we can see since devolution occurred is that we've had enormous amounts of progress. Obviously, our institution has got no view at all on the Constitution, but what we can see is that constitutional change has brought about change in terms of linguistic policy. What might happen if the country becomes independent? I'm not absolutely certain. That will depend to a great extent. If the country becomes independent, will it be economically successful? If it is, will there be more money to promote and encourage institutions like ours? I don't know. That's up to the politicians to decide. And when people vote in 2014, they'll be making those decisions and we'll have to take the consequences one way or the other. But I can't see that, my own experience so far is that constitutional change has helped us make our case. Further constitutional change might have the same impact.
And on a more local level, what kind of things would you like to see in the schools with regard to Scots?
Well, we have to absolutely stop right now people being told that the way they're speaking is wrong. And we hear terrible stories still about people being told that saying words like hoose and hame and out and are wrong. I mean, and even like words like I, for goodness sake, I mean, we have to move on from that situation. It's absolutely absurd, wrong, disgraceful, and utterly unacceptable. It's totally, totally wrong. And that has to stop immediately. And if nothing else, we must get to that point soon. So even if there's nothing done to encourage the language, even if the adoption of a neutral position by the education authorities would be a vast improvement. Now, you talked about people being dissuaded from speaking Scots, and there was disgusting examples of physical punishment meted out to children in the past, which is just unspeakable. But we're thankfully beyond that. But the truth of the matter is we still hear frequently stories about people, ignorant teachers, saying to children that the way they're speaking is slang, wrong, ignorant.
Could you give an example without naming names, obviously?
No, the thing is, Michael, we're hearing this stuff all the time. We're hearing from young people, from parents, from people who contact the centre, that children are being told this stuff is wrong. It's just not acceptable. So what we have to do is we've got to move on from that position. And a neutral position in terms of language, at least, would be something of an improvement. But the reality is that the government has developed policies to support Scots. They've developed a network of coordinators, or at least they're in the process of developing a network of coordinators who will have responsible for encouraging Scots in schools. And we'll see some progress on that, I think, in the next few months. The other thing that's coming soon is the census results will be out in June. Now, for the first time in 2011, people were asked to say whether they could speak Scots or not. We were very much involved in getting that question into the census. The Scots Language Centre had the leading role in persuading the government and the GROS, the General Registrar Office for Scotland, to put the question into the census, and we mounted an information campaign to get people to understand better what the question meant and to work out whether or not they should say they do speak Scots. Now, in June, we'll have an idea for the first time, or a clearer idea than we've ever had before, of how many people speak the language, where they speak it, what demographic groups they fall into, and then we'll be able to develop policy on the basis of the data that previously wasn't there. So we're very much looking forward to that coming out. And that'll have a gigantic impact on, we believe, on future projects and on the ways support for Scots is delivered. So that'll have an impact on schools as well.
Thank you very much. And just one last thing. If people wanted to donate to the centre, can they do that through your website?
They can. It's a donation button on the site, so they need to go to the site, find the donation button, and send us some money. Now, we're a small organisation, obviously, and we do rely on contributions from supporters. And we've had a very nice, successful year recently. We've had some good contributions, but we're still running on a shoestring. And this language is not well funded. I think our total funding is still very small. So anybody wanting to donate, we'd love to hear from them. But the key thing is, please come to the website, listen to the language, appreciate how beautiful it is. But this is something really extraordinary that we have here. It's the closest language that there is to English. It tells us about English as well, about other Germanic languages. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And listen out for this language being spoken. A lot of people say to me, people have said to me in the past, I never hear Scots. Well, for goodness sake, open your lugs. Listen to folk. Listen to how folk are speaking round about you. Tour around the country. Go to different parts of the country that maybe aren't familiar with. Listen out to how folk are speaking and think to yourself, my God, what a fantastic place we live, that we've got this incredibly linguistically diverse community. And for 1,000 years, this wonderful Germanic language has been spoken here. This incredible production of cultural artefacts has occurred in connection with it. And it's here, it's living, it's part of who we are. And if we didn't have it, we really would be a much poorer place.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. So there we are. Sorry about the little loss of sound in the middle there. You'll have to blame Mr. Broadband for that. There wasn't really anything we could do about it. Just to say that For All That will be on Wednesday this week. So this has been your alternative Sunday listening. And then for next week we'll get back to normal. For All That on Sunday and the Scottish Independence podcast on Wednesday. As usual, for the Scottish Independence podcast, the guest chooses the tune. So what Michael chose was an old folk ballad called Edward, and this version is by Old Blind Dogs. So, hope you enjoyed that, and speak to you next time.
Why does your brandy drop your bleed, young Edward, oh young Edward? Why does your brandy drop your bleed, and why so sad, young Yeo? Why does your brandy drop your bleed, young Edward, oh young Edward? Why does your brandy drop your bleed, and why so sad, young Yeo? I had killed my hoxie greed, my dear mother, my dear mother. I had killed my hoxie greed, and I had nae mere but Yeo. I had killed my hoxie greed, my dear mother, my dear mother. I had killed my hoxie greed, and I had nae mere but Yeo. Your hawker's blood was never sae red, young Edward, oh young Edward. Your hawker's blood was never sae red, my dear son, I touch thee, oh. Your hawker's blood was never sae red, young Edward, oh young Edward. Your hawker's blood was never sae red, my dear son, I touch thee, oh. I had killed my redron steed, my dear mother, my dear mother. I had killed my redron steed, that durst was so fair and free, oh. I had killed my redron steed, my dear mother, my dear mother. I had killed my redron steed, that durst was so fair and free, oh. Your steed was all that ye got there, young Edward, oh young Edward. Yes, it was all that ye had got near some other do you drio. Yes, it was all that ye had got near young Edward, oh young Edward. Yes, it was all that ye had got near some other do you drio. I had killed my father dear, my dear mother, my dear mother. I had killed my father dear, alas and ways me. I had killed